Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
It's funny sometimes the significance that a minority of people attach to things that are really quite innocuous to the rest of our species. In some places, whether you pour milk into your tea or your tea into milk makes all the difference in the world. Wearing white after Labor Day? I mean, really, who cares? Sometimes the reasons for these strange rules is rooted in public decency and even religious arguments. Breastfeeding in public makes the news. It makes the news in North America. But in half of the rest of the world, nobody thinks anything of it. In certain non-Western countries, women have to even go so far as to cover their hair. Our society just doesn't get that. But then again, it wasn't so long ago that in our Western society, it was outrageous for women to show their ankles. And it really wasn't so long ago that having to work on a Sunday was uncommon, unreasonable even. It needed to be justified and excused. Scott, do you remember the day when they changed the laws here in Ontario when working on a Sunday was now allowed?
I don't know, absolutely. And I remember the lead up to it, the political fighting that went on, and the inconsistency of the laws. My father was in the drugstore business, and some retailers were angry because the drugstores got to stay open, and that didn't seem fair. So they had to shut down the front part of the store. Oh yeah, all of that stuff. So and that's what the 80s, I think, that was going on.
And yet in other countries, people were working 7 days a week.
Yeah.
Sometimes the reason for the peculiarities that some people have just can't be put into words. U.S. Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart is famous for his answer to the question, what defines pornography? His answer, I can't define obscenity, but I know it when I see it. Today, we're going to look at another example of a peculiarity that's characteristic of a certain small section of human society, one that's endemic in certain parts of the Christian community. And it's this: the attention and importance attached to the idea of a primal couple, a first representative human, Adam, or we should say Adam and Eve. Over the last 2 weeks, we've heard from two scholars about a number of very different views on that question, and those two episodes generated enough questions and problems and concerns to merit a response episode from Scott and myself.
It's interesting the context that you've put this in, because especially, of course, in the Christian community, especially in the more conservative end of the Christian community, this is a big deal. And yet, when you really start to think about it and analyze it, you start to think, well, why is it a big deal, and how did we get here, and and so on.
And we're going to get into that.
Yeah, we're going to get into that today. Yeah.
But before we get into those comments and our responses, we should do some clarifying, because there seem to be some fundamental misperceptions in the comments left at the Facebook sites, and also in some conversations that I've had with people. I don't know, Scott, if you've been talking to people about this. And the first thing I wanted to clarify is the two creation accounts in the book of Genesis. There's two of them.
Yes, there are, which many people find surprising when they haven't been exposed to kind of a more critical analysis of the of Genesis. But yeah, in chapter 1, you have kind of a creation, the creation of humanity and the earth. It's a big picture, it's a bird's eye view. And in fact, even in verse 1:1, you have what many scholars now would argue is a kind of a summary statement. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, full stop, right?
Right.
And then it goes on to delineate that creation process in a poem. But then all of a sudden you go from that big picture, the cosmos, the cosmological picture, and now in chapter 2, a different account where you hone in very much on humanity, and humanity's role in all this. Yeah.
And so chapter 1 was the one that people remember, all those 6 days. On day 1, this happened, and day 3 and day 4, that kind of thing, right? And now chapter 2.
Exactly. And linguistically and so on, without getting into the details, it's pretty well agreed upon now that there really are fairly distinct accounts, and very likely authored by more than one person, yeah. So that used to be a big bone of contention, but even that things have changed in that regard. Even most conservative scholars even now would be comfortable with that. But back when I was in in seminary. Actually, that was a big issue. There was a
And what was that
general.
the issue? What was at the
Well,
heart of
the
the issue?
issue that well, the generally the issue was in conservative circles, the belief was that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, the whole thing, except for maybe the very last part where he dies, obviously,
Right.
but that he wrote it, and that he wrote it as one author, right? So the idea that there were actually multiple authors was seen as a real threat to
Oh, okay.
biblical, to biblical inerrancy and so on. That is not the case now. I would say the vast majority of even conservative scholars are comfortable with that, but that's a change from 100 years ago.
Right. I thought the contention was not so much the authorship, but rather the fact that they look like two different stories. And so some people, I know non-scholars would say they didn't even notice that the two stories don't make sense. They're different stories, as if the authors didn't recognize that.
Right. Right.
The second chapter being the one where a human is made, a man is made, and then
Yeah.
from his rib, the woman is made.
Right.
And then later on, the animals are made. So it is a very different story. But
yeah, and all of that kind of, at least for me, makes me realize that what the biblical authors are trying to say and what's important to them in their narrative is not necessarily what would be important to us. We think when we're reading Genesis, we're reading a historical account, and we're not in the modern sense at all. Really, we're reading a very theological account, a very religious account of the cosmos and man and woman in their, what is their place in that cosmos, and how did we get to where we are, and so on and so forth. So that's what's important to them. And I think that is becoming a fairly well accepted approach now. I go to a pretty conservative church, and even our pastor, when he has spoken on Genesis, has made the point that we're not dealing here with history and so on in the way that we moderns would think of it.
I still wonder about that, though, Scott, because certainly today, a lot of Christians would see, okay, it was in 6 days, there were 24-hour periods, and we know the day that, the stars came into being, and we know the day when the sky animals came into being, and they would say that's the way it happened. It's historical.
Yes.
And we know that goes at least back to when fundamentalism began to rise, say a couple hundred years ago.
Yeah.
But then we also know that the church, the Roman Catholic Church, 1,000 years ago, they did believe this as historical.
Yes.
We can go back to Paul. Paul, I think, said this was historical. We'll talk later on about what he had to say about Adam, but even the fact that he said, because the woman sinned first, they are the weaker vessel.
Right.
And so clearly he's saying, okay, this is the way it happened. I think he thought it was historical.
Yeah.
And then I wonder how we can say, well, yeah, but the authors themselves didn't think it was historical. I think they did. I think they were writing down what they thought is the way it happened.
Well, yes, but in a very different, there's no doubt the literary form, for example, of Genesis 1 is poetic, and if you match it up against the accounts of creation in the Mesopotamian world around that same time, it very much fits in with those, right? So they're not writing as moderns would write. Now, the question of somebody like Paul or whatever, they would have taken that, I guess, at face value. They had no reason to really question it.
And the problem doesn't end there. A lot of people think there's two different accounts, but there are other places in the Bible where there's other creation accounts.
Right.
Proverbs 8, Job chapters 26, 28, 38, Psalms 104, a couple of, there's other examples there where there's other versions of the way things happen, and they don't all match up exactly.
No, they don't.
We may need to do an episode on that sometime. Let's move on to a couple other clarifications, one of which is Joshua's idea, his basic presentation. There were people who were a bit confused. They didn't quite get what he was proposing, and I think there were two main points that weren't clear enough to the listeners when we did the episode with Josh. And the first thing was it had to do with the fundamental difference between genetic and genealogical. And so here's one example of one of the listeners saying, hey, I didn't quite get this. This is a comment posted by Robert. And this was a long thread of exchanges between him and several other people. And Robert said, was it being said that it could be proven through genealogy that all the world's current population could have descended from a single ancestral couple? At the start of the episode, the discussion of genetics was touched on. And in episode 18, I thought it was stated that through genetic studies, by tracing back DNA, there would be no way that our current population could have descended from a couple living 6,000 years ago. Aren't the genetic and genealogical methods coming to incompatible conclusions, or am I hearing this wrong? To spell that out, I mean that if one method says we might have all descended from a common ancestor living 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, and another method says that the earliest common ancestor would be 200,000 years ago, they can't both be right. I might be thinking about this all wrong, so please enlighten me. That was Robert's comment, and there were others similar. They're saying, I don't
Sure.
quite get this genealogical thing. So, without repeating too much of what was said in the interview with Josh, let me just say this. I think everyone's familiar with the idea of a genetic relationship. It's solely measured by where you get your DNA from. And the only way that molecule and that connection is passed on is through sex. Okay, ignoring the special case of in vitro fertilization and other modern technologies like those.
Even there, it is sexual in the biological sense. It's just
Yes,
not. It's
in
just, yeah,
at its fundamental,
yeah.
yeah. Now, the genealogical relationship, on the other hand, is not about a molecule, but about a social contract. It's a social construct. And that connection is passed on simply through social mechanisms, not only the process of parenting, but also agreements like marriages and adoptions. So there is an overlap between these two kinds of relationships. Whether you say you're passing on your molecule or whether you're parenting, you're really saying the same thing. And in that sense, genetic and genealogical relationships can look very similar. But here's how they begin to be different. As soon as two people get married in a modern sense, both immediately become part of a second family line. They marry into a family tree or a lineage. They become genealogically related, even though they probably have absolutely no genes, no DNA, no genetic connection to the other family line. All of their biological kids, on the other hand, will be both genetically and genealogically related to each other. They all have the same parents. They dipped into the same two pools of DNA, so they're related both genetically and genealogically. And that's different from their parents. But it gets more complicated than that. An adopted kid usually will have no genetic relationship to those biological kids or the parents. But upon being adopted, all of a sudden, that adopted kid becomes genealogically related to the two adopting families. And that's in addition to the genetic and genealogical relationships they already had through their biological parents. So it gets really messy in the case of adopted kids. And not only will that adopted kid never be genetically related to the family that adopted them, neither will any of their children or grandchildren or great grandchildren ever be genetically related, even though they're fully genealogically related. You can see how this whole idea of genetic and genealogical relationships can be similar, and yet they can get very different, and it gets very messy in the case of genealogical relationships. So if you're still confused on one level about Joshua's proposal, try to listen again to that episode, but this time try to keep in mind this idea of a molecular DNA connection versus a social construct connection. One is material and one is immaterial.
And I can understand the confusion. I mean, it is something that you have to reflect on a bit to get your head around. Probably, if somebody's interested, Swamidass's book would also be a good way to
Yeah.
for at least with his line of thinking. But I do think that it is kind of a fascinating approach. That is certainly creative. I don't know that anybody until Josh has come up with that distinction. To make that argument. That the Bible is
Right.
really talking about genealogy, and you could make the case scientifically that we're all genealogically related as opposed to genetically. So yeah.
Okay, so Scott, I also thought I'd come up with a bit of a numbers exercise to emphasize the difference between these two, to show how they're similar and yet very different. I already did do this for the genetic relationships when we talked to Joshua Swamidass, and here's a really condensed version. Because everybody has two parents, the number of people that they're connected to doubles with every generation we go back in time. So I am genetically related to two parents and four grandparents and eight great grandparents and 16 great great grandparents, and you get the idea. And you don't have to go back too many generations in the past before you find out that I'm genetically related to more people than existed on the face of the planet. We found out a couple of weeks ago that it's only 50 generations. You go back 50 generations, 50 doublings, and you get, I forget the number, but it's more than a quadrillion people.
Yeah.
Science and mathematics tell me that I have a genetic linkage to a quadrillion ancestors. But now let's talk about genealogy, and I'm going to go in the opposite direction. We're going to do the same kind of mental hopscotch, but this time we're going to start from the distant past and move forward through time. When we talk about genealogy, we're talking about lineages. And so we're going to talk about this lineage moving forward in time. And to keep the number small and simple, I'm just going to pretend that we're only dealing with 100 people living on the face of the planet when we start this exercise, rather than a quadrillion. It'll get really hard to explain then. But just imagine we have 100 people on the face of the planet. Each of those 100 people has the potential to have a long line of descendants, kids and grandkids and great-grandkids. I say the potential because not all of them will. Some of them will be eaten by a lion. Some of them will get cancer before they can reproduce. But all 100 have the potential to produce a lineage. And so you line them up, and we'll give the names of these lineages numbers. So the fifth person in line will come up with lineage number 5, and the 84th person will give rise to lineage 84. You get the idea. Now let's talk about genealogy. As soon as those ancestors start coupling up, they begin to link together two different lineages. So when person number 4 and person number 8 have kids, those kids will each be from a combined lineage, and we'll call that 4/8. Another generation later, when someone from lineage 4/8 has kids with someone from lineage, 32/81, their kids will now be at the top of a lineage which combines 4 of the original 100 lineages from generation 1. And so we're going to call that new lineage 4/8/32/81. That third generation of kids will all be genealogically related to ancestors from those 4 different family lines. Now let's take another step forward, another generation down the line. When people from lineage 4/8/32/81 produces kids with person from lineage, let's make this up, 13/41/66/96, their kids will be at the top of a family tree that has 8 different numbers. They've linked 8 different lineages. And you can see, if you go through this step by step, it doesn't take very long before all those original 100 lineages can be intertangled together such that everyone alive on the planet is genealogically related to every one of those original 100 ancestors.
Yeah, I think that, to me, makes it pretty clear. Sometimes I would recommend maybe even people who are listening, if they want to write down some of those numbers as you've been going. A podcast isn't visual. This is a case where a visual would certainly be helpful. But yeah, it really shows that it doesn't take very long, many generations to come to the realization that, everybody is related genealogically.
Now, so that was part of Joshua's proposal, but he did take it one step further. And this is where some people start to have problems with this. He proposes that God could have. He's careful to keep emphasizing that this is all realm of possibility stuff, that he's not necessarily coming down on one side or the other, but I think he does. Joshua does come down on the one side that I'm not on. Joshua proposed that God could have created 2 brand new individuals named Adam and Eve, not through biological evolution, but something closer to what's described in Genesis chapter 2. And God then plunked those 2 brand new, specially created humans into a much larger population of pre-existing humans, all of whom went through the normal process of biological evolution that we're all familiar with. And then when you go through that thought exercise that I just did a minute ago, through the magical process of being fruitful and multiplying, Adam and Eve eventually become the ancestors of every human alive on the face of the planet today.
Yeah, it's even as you're saying it, it just seems so, I don't know what the word for it, I guess contrived. Like in a way, like I'm a big literature guy. I read a lot of literature and stuff, and a good narrative, you don't want contrivance in it. You want it, you want it to seem like a kind of a natural flow, in the sense that you've got this whole natural thing going on, and then all of a sudden in the middle of it, God plops these 2 people into that. Yeah. It just seems odd and seems kind of unlikely, in the sense that, why. And I know you could say, well, we can't question God. Sure, if you want to retreat to that, but it seems strange to me that he would allow this process of evolution to bring about human beings and so on, and then somewhere in the middle of all that, plop a couple into that. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't fit very well. But yeah, could it be? Sure, could be.
And we will come back to why that contrivance might have been contrived. We'll talk about that later on in the episode. So that was some clarifying about Joshua's proposal. We also had some questions about William Lane Craig's proposal, which Denis summarized for us in our interview with him. We wanted to hear about that very ancient Adam proposal simply because it was so diametrically opposite to Joshua's very recent Adam proposal. And my goal was not to do a whole episode with William Lane Craig solely on his new book. But I knew that Denis had done a scholarly review of that book. I was going to be talking with him anyway, and so I asked him to do a quick summary of Craig's idea. I thought that was fair. So the two clarifications I want to make about Craig's proposal are these. The first, Craig pushes the so-called Adam, in air quotes, he pushes Adam so far back in ancient history, and he identifies Adam as a member of Homo heidelbergensis because he finds it hard to argue that this is the clarification. People were wondering, why did he go all the way back there? His reason was he found it hard to argue that Neanderthals are any different than Homo sapiens on any measurable criterion that he, Craig, associates with the imago Dei, the image of God. Things like an ability for reason. He says Neanderthals were equally able. Creativity, love, compassion, many other things that he says are characteristics of the imago Dei, Neanderthals seem to show them as well. And by the way, I want to comment, his definition of the imago Dei here is it's a Hellenic Greek interpretation of the imago Dei, and that's very different from the ancient Hebrew interpretation of the imago Dei. And that might be more important here. We may need to do an episode someday on that, but there are two very different ways to describe this imago Dei, and one is Hellenic Greek and one is ancient Hebrew. And
I wonder if you want to expand that a little bit. Just in a nutshell, what are the two?
okay, the Hellenic Greek one is more, it has to do with your mind, your cognitive abilities, reason, emotions,
Right.
creativity, forethought, all these
Yep.
sorts of things, everything related to your brain. And it was very much a dualistic idea that the mind was something immaterial that inhabited the material body, and that's the image of God was that immaterial component. The ancient Hebrew idea is more of a communal, and by the way, the ancient Hellenic Greek was very individual. Like we all have our own soul, our own spirit, our
Mm,
own image of God. We are all each created in the image of God, and it's a very
mm.
individual thing. Whereas the ancient Hebrew idea was it was a communal thing, that humans were created in the image of God as a community, and we are put here. And there's that whole
Well, it's very vocational. It's we're kind of God's vice regents of creation. That's the message of Genesis. That we're partners,
right.
right? And that's very different from the Greek idea, which is much more kind of philosophical and rationalistic.
Right. And as vice regents of creation, again, getting at the idea that we are put on Earth to care for the planet, to care for the animals, and to
Yes,
care for each other, you
right.
know?
Yeah,
So,
Peter Enns has brought this out, as others have, that the whole picture in Genesis is of a sacred space in Genesis 1, the creation of a temple, which fits in very
right,
well with the Mesopotamian mindset. And in that culture, every god had a temple, and every temple had an image, a physical image of that god in the temple. The writer of Genesis is saying, well, we have a temple too, but guess what? That temple is creation, and the image in that temple isn't a piece of wood, it's us. So we image God in that temple, which is, I think, fascinating, but yeah, very, very distinct and different from the kind of Greek worldview. It's
yeah,
interesting that later on in Christian history and in Christian theology, the Greek view ends up taking over.
yeah,
I found it very interesting when I read many years ago Calvin's Institutes, that Calvin is very exegetical throughout most of the Institutes. He's dealing with scripture. However, when he gets to the immortality of the soul, the references to Aristotle are just overwhelming. He hardly deals with scripture at all. He basically, the whole argument is very much an Aristotelian argument, which was the science of his day, right?
right,
So I don't want to overly fault Calvin, but it's just interesting that that's where that derives from, not so much biblical material,
right.
Yeah. However, that is a detailed discussion and a very interesting one, I think, but better safe for another time.
Yeah, we need more time. Okay, so what Craig is saying here then is that there's no difference between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. They're the same when you measure them by these criterion that he has for the Imago Dei. So, and we need to come up with a common ancestor. So he takes one step backwards in time and comes up with heidelbergensis, who was the progenitor, the ancestor for both Neanderthals and humans. That's why he did that. And that's one thing we never explained in that episode. I don't think we ever did say, why did he go that far back? That's the reason why. Well, and now the second clarification I wanted to make is Craig's motive for doing this, which is simply to protect Scripture, especially New Testament Scripture. Craig feels that because Jesus and the Apostle Paul refer to Adam in air quotes, then we need to do so as well, or else we can't hang on to any of their other teachings. that classic line that people say, well, if they were wrong about this, then what else were
Right.
they wrong about?
Yeah.
And I don't agree with that. I don't think you have to do that. I'm comfortable with the idea that both Jesus and Paul were men of their era. They grew up thinking that way because of their culture and their zeitgeist. And even if one wants to say that Jesus was fully divine and therefore he must have known better, I'm okay with adding to that statement, he may have known better, but he was speaking to an audience that did not. There was no point in him talking about quarks or genetics or the carburetor of a gas fueled engine, because to do so would just take so much time and energy to explain to his audience. And it was just more convenient, more efficient to use their language and reduce the arguments to their level. I do that all the time when I'm teaching scientific ideas, and we call that accommodating to your audience. Several of our listeners also question whether Craig was making a mistake, but trying to protect scripture. Here's one comment from a listener named John. He wrote, I would ask Craig how his theory squares with symbolic art and thought not being in evidence that long ago. The way he defines human, heidelbergensis was not human. That's what John said. Here's another one from Me Crum, who wrote, as already mentioned, going back that far with Craig, how would that tie them into starting to wear clothes, farm the land, had marriage, and their kids and grandkids using weapons and musical instruments like flutes, and also built cities and tents and so on? They could speak. Was language defined that far back? I just don't think so. And I think where John and me Crum are both going is the same thing. It's this idea. If Craig is trying to protect the authority of Scripture, then what does he think about later passages in Genesis which say that it was within a handful of generations later that the descendants of Adam built cities, they invented agriculture, they invented musical instruments and metallurgy and language and all kinds of things. And then there's one other comment from one of our listeners. This is another John, not the same one, who wrote, I found both Swamidass's view and the Craig view to be ridiculous contortions that try to have it both ways. And the more they try to make Adam relevant, the smaller they make God. I wonder if both men will try to make an historical narrative out of the flood of Babel next. This corner of Christianity that is so uncomfortable with the genre of early Genesis, well, it's like running into professors of ancient Greece who are trying to figure out which department store sold Pandora her box.
Yeah, that's an insightful comment, and I tend to agree with it. It seems to me that throughout this whole exploration, that particularly in the case of William Lane Craig, more so I think than Josh Swamidass, but even there's still that concordism still rears its ugly head, in the sense that there's still
Right.
there's a desire, if somehow we can make the Bible scientific, that we can make it compatible with what we know from modern science, that we'd still like to do that if we can,
Right.
I personally, I gave up on that. I not gave up on it. I just don't think it's the right approach. I don't think it respects the Bible for what it is. It makes the Bible into something we maybe wish it was, and then try to conform it to that. But we're not really respecting the Bible for what God has actually given us in the Scriptures. So I think I certainly sympathize with that critique.
So that's what we heard from three of our listeners. We couldn't do all of the comments that were made. How about yourself, Scott? Were you sold on the arguments that we heard from Swamidass or William Lane Craig through the mouth of Denis Alexander?
Well, I think the least sold I would be on would be William Lane Craig. I just find kind of special pleading and trying to make the Scriptures fit into his ideas of what they should be. Swamidass, I think it's an interesting argument and creative, but I don't know that it adds much. Certain doesn't add much to the science, I don't think. And as far as theologically, I like the idea of the emphasis on genealogy, because the Bible is very concerned about genealogy. So I think that's kind of an interesting thread. But I don't know if I've much more to say. It just seems that all of this still leans toward kind of a concordist idea that we have to have two progenitors of the whole human race. Somehow we've got to have that. So Swamidass's answer is we can have that genealogically, and Craig is heidelbergensis, and that leads to I think what you're anticipating, Why is
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, and that's my main concern with this whole discussion. Those two episodes, not necessarily specifically with either of them, but even we talked about that big pile of books that were written by other scholars and all this emphasis. That's my concern. Why is this topic so important?
Right.
At the top of the episode, I called attention to certain unique and peculiar interests that certain subgroups of people have. For some of these interests, their adherents can articulate and explain clearly, others not so much. And this question, who was the first human, is uniquely of interest to a small subgroup of humans, namely Christians. And I'm not convinced that they were able to articulate the reason why very coherently or consistently. Now, in case some might think that this question is of broader interest than what I'm giving it credit for, let me be clear. I'm not referring to the question of where humans as a species came from or how did our species get here.
Hmm.
That question is of broad interest, not just to Christians. In fact, not just any people of any religion. That question, where did our species come from, is of interest to everybody, including staunch atheists and secular scientists. That question doesn't just tell us about where we came from and doesn't just explain some of our present day quirks. So things like why we do certain things a certain way and build the societies that we do. That question might even tell us something about our future, especially as we start monkeying around with our genes and manipulating DNA
Hmm.
and building, AI, artificial intelligence, and breaking down social barriers and creating newer societies. We need to know more about ourselves as a species. So that's not what I'm getting at. That's not the question I'm referring to. The question I am putting under the microscope here sounds very similar, but it's very different. It's the question of who was Adam? Who was the first individual or the first human couple? That question is dominating a lot of interest in a certain slice of the pie that we call Christianity.
And particularly, the conservative wing of Christianity, or the more conservative wing of Christianity. The liberals have dispensed with that many years ago. So,
Yeah, yeah. And I need to ask, why is this so important? Why are you asking this question? Because one's answer to that follow-up question often shapes the answer to the original question of who was Adam. So it's kind of like when a complete stranger walks up to me and asks, "Are you Luke Jansen?" I'm probably
mm,
going to ask, "Who's asking?" Or "Why are you asking?" Right?
right.
I want to know why people are so interested in this question of who is Adam before we try to answer it.
For me, it's fairly obvious why,
Yeah.
because there are some important Christian beliefs that seem to hang on there being an original couple, Adam and Eve, namely what we refer to as the fall. The idea that mankind started out perfect and has fallen into a state of rebellion, and B, that sinful state has spread throughout the race, that we are born with it, namely what we call original sin. And then that, of course, all being connected to the idea that we needed to be rescued from that, which relates to then, of course, Jesus' death and the atonement. So there are big, big theological, weighty theological issues that many would argue hang on the reality of a historical Adam and Eve. And I think that's really the crux of why this is seen as so important by that particular group.
And that's the thing, Scott. You've hit the nail on the head, and I want to unpack that in just a little bit more detail. I really want to drive this home before we get into the weeds on this question. This question of who was the primal couple is not just a curiosity. It's not like a trivia question, why is the sky blue? And it's not just an esoteric question for a small group of nerds like, whether Microsoft is better than Apple or who's got the best basketball team. This is also not as esoteric as the person whose hobby is researching their family tree and telling how they found out they relate to King Henry or, I don't know, William of Orange or Billy the Kid. I mean, if you make claims like that, many people will politely show interest and indulge the person telling the story. But that fact, that connection to Billy the Kid or William of Orange, that really doesn't mean too much to the listener. But establishing a direct relationship with Adam and Eve and emphasizing that it's true for everyone else alive on the planet, that's an entirely different thing. This is not an esoteric question. This is a question that has an agenda behind it. And I think everyone who's wrestling with this topic, who's writing and talking about the first Adam or the first Adam and Eve, because we often leave her out of it when
Yeah.
it takes two to tango, they're doing this because they're holding a certain worldview and they're taking for granted certain assumptions. and they're part of a theological agenda, whether they're conscious of doing so or if it's subconscious. That agenda is this: they're trying to put all of us underneath that umbrella of Adam and Eve, and I've referred to it as an umbrella of guilt, an umbrella of debt or of sin. And Christians who feel the need to identify a first human or first couple want to establish this fact. They want to take it as a given so they can push a certain theological train of thought, which includes, as you said, Scott, original sin, which then requires a theological response, atonement theory, because that's what Paul did. He talked about the first Adam and then Christ, the last Adam. And then that leads to penal substitution. And then, don't even get me started about what it says about, hell and eternal conscious torment in hell. I find that kind of reasoning, I can't use the word logic here, but that kind of reasoning is really very difficult now for me. It's unreasonable because if I have a great grandfather who's guilty of some kind of a mass murder, to me, there's absolutely no justice at all in making my granddaughter even the least bit guilty of what he did. And yet, trying to trace all humans to one person or one couple is only important to make us all guilty of what they did. So it's like you said, Scott, this is all about the idea of original sin. That question, who is Adam, is fundamentally rooted in promoting the idea of original sin and where that leads after that. And so then we have this pile of books written by Christian scholars all trying to answer that question, who is Adam, and doing it in various ways and having various interpretations of Genesis and introducing new ideas like heidelbergensis and genealogical relationships and what have you, and a lot of other ideas like that with a lot of hand waving. And here's the thing, when you have to work so hard to push an idea, I think at some point we need to say, maybe we're pushing this too far and we need to redo our thinking, our argument, in this case, our theology. And so let me use an analogy here. This is one that I've used before. A historian trying to present his thesis describing Abraham Lincoln's role in founding the communist government in China in the 20th century. I'll say that again. Abraham Lincoln's role in founding the communist government in China in the 20th century. It wouldn't matter how much hand-waving he did and how persuasively he talked and how many pictures he showed and things that he said. He might want to argue his thesis till the cows come home from milking, but as soon as someone points out that Abraham Lincoln didn't even live during the 20th century and never left American soil, then that historian needs to sit down and adjust his story. And I think we're at that point now with this whole Adam and Eve story. I think we need to look at, okay, what role are they playing in our theology?
Yeah, totally agree with that. And it kind of begs the question, what is the linkage between some of these doctrines to that reality? In other words, is it true that we need a historical, Adam and Eve to come to these theological conclusions or not? Can they be reconstrued in a way that still does justice to the essence of what Paul's teaching and so on, but don't depend on the belief in a historical Adam and Eve? I think that's kind of a key question.
And I think here's one way that we can do that. Instead of the story being about one primal couple and what they did, I do accept that the story can be about what we humans collectively and individually are at our core. Not so much what they did, but what we are. That we collectively and individually are flawed deep inside. That even the best among us are capable of some really horrific things. And nobody should try to delude themselves and think that they're not capable of doing really horrific things. That flawed nature comes from the journey we humans took through evolutionary history, biological history. A lot of evidence for all of that. And we talked about that new understanding of original sin in a lot of detail in episode number 18. And it was the idea that we've been on an evolutionary trajectory, an upward trajectory towards an ideal. And we all collectively and individually keep falling short of that ideal, because of the instincts and weaknesses and value systems that we have ingrained into us over billions of years of evolutionary history. So in that sense, it comes from our ancestry, it comes from our ancestors, but we don't get it from a primal couple who appeared as some undefinable, inscrutable, non-existent bottom part of a branch on the evolutionary tree of life.
Yeah, I think it's pretty empirically verifiable that human beings are kind of broken, in the sense of our tendency toward violence, our tendency toward our difficulty with civilization itself. I mean, civilization hangs always sits on a knife's edge, even though we in the West have benefited for so long from, our democracies and so on. We can take this for granted, but all you have to do is look at the world around you, and you pretty quickly understand that this shouldn't be taken for granted. Our tendency is not toward civilization; it's kind of toward uncivilization.
Yeah.
And we have to constantly restrain ourselves and constantly listen to as Lincoln said, the greater angels of our nature. But anyway, yeah.
Scott, I agree with every word you just said, except for one word.
Okay.
You began that with the word that we're broken. And it's that word that I struggle with now. I don't think that we're broken, because that implies that we are at one point where, the opposite of broken is fixed or whole, perfect, that kind of thing. I don't think we're broken. I just think that we're flawed. We're deeply flawed beings. And I'm fully.
But to push back, couldn't I make the same argument about flawed? I mean, you can only be flawed if you're comparing it to something that isn't flawed.
If you want to put it that way, sure. Then how about the word imperfect? That we are imperfect.
You still got the same problem. See, this to me is kind of a fundamental issue, because I don't know how the materialist argues for, for example, that we shouldn't. Well, I do know they would argue on a pragmatic basis. They would say violence just isn't good for the species, and so on and so forth. But I don't buy that argument completely. But the point is that we seem to have this sense that we ought to be better than we are.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we were at some point in time perfect. I'm not saying that, but there does seem this innate sense, what Lewis called, a clue to the meaning of the universe. The idea that we have the sense of an oughtness, right? And without reference to some sort of metaphysics, that's hard to justify, I think.
Okay, pushback to your pushback to my pushback to your pushback. Evolution, right? You can talk about animals that are evolving, and they're always evolving to something a little bit better, a little bit faster, a little bit more efficient. There's always something, it's a little bit better. Let's just use that word. It's a little bit better.
What does better mean? The same way, better adapted?
Well, that's just, it can be better at catching things, better at reproducing, that sort of thing. And so in the same way, we can apply that same concept to this idea of humans evolving to something better. We're getting rid of some habits that we're recognizing now. Okay, we don't need to kill people for our food, and we don't need to be so tribal and to identify people by the color of their skin as the enemy. We're realizing that. And so we are getting better and better and better, but it doesn't mean, it certainly doesn't mean that we were ever perfect and we're broken and
that I agree with. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
So then I'm going to carry on, Scott.
Yep.
Stop with the pushbacks. Let's talk about Paul, because a lot of our proponents of this original sin story are referring to Paul. Paul frequently refers to a very specific individual named Adam. And I want to say two things about that. First, and I mentioned this in our interview with Denis, and I think I might have mentioned it with Joshua, Paul was a man of his time, his era, and context. He mentioned how he also sincerely believed in a literal underground hell deep under the earth's surface, which we now know just is not there, but Paul believed it. And a third heaven somewhere up above Earth's atmosphere, which, by the way, again, we know it's not there. What the idea was back then was that you had three heavens. You had the heaven in which the birds and the butterflies and the bats and what have you flew. Then above that was the heaven in which you had the stars and the planets and the sun, that sort of thing. And then you had the third heaven, which was populated by the angels and by God and, the divine council. Well, we know that there's not a third heaven up somewhere above Earth's atmosphere, but Paul believed in that kind of a hell and that kind of a heaven because of his Greek Hellenic context and their understanding of the cosmos. Paul firmly believed that food sacrificed to idols was an abomination for Christians to eat because of his very Jewish, Pharisaic upbringing and education. Then he changed his mind on that because of his Christian conversion. So I'm getting at the idea that he holds beliefs based on his context. Paul hung on to the idea that men must have short hair and women must have long hair, and that women must keep their hair covered and that they were the weaker vessels because of his ancient Semitic roots. And so in the same way, he would have been indoctrinated with the book of Genesis, which describes the creation of a first man named Adam, a first primal couple that included Eve, because of his first century Jewish context. They had no reason whatsoever to think differently. They didn't have fossils, no Neanderthal skeletons, no human and chimp genome, no genetic evidence of any kind. But we today have dropped or rejected a lot of early Greek Hellenic ideas and a lot of Jewish Pharisaic values and a lot of early Semitic thinking. So do we have to continue to think about Adam as a real unique person in history just because Paul did?
Well, that's the question. And underlying that question is our understanding, I guess, of inspiration and revelation. If you have a view of inspiration that, everything Paul said must be taken at face value or whatever, then it is difficult to reconcile those things, right?
Right.
But if you're comfortable with saying that inspiration it's a mixture of the divine and the human, in a sense, like that God inspired real people in historical context with the knowledge he didn't hand them knowledge they didn't have, right?
Right.
He didn't inspire Paul to say, oh, you know what? Physics is really made up of atoms and quarks and near. He didn't do that. He very much all through the Bible, you see men and women who are very much people of their time. And if you're comfortable with believing that through that process, God can still inspire and reveal himself, then, so let's say Paul believed in an Adam in a way we wouldn't today. But for us, that Adam thing is, the Adam thing is more of we would consider it a story. That wasn't a historical story, but it was a story. Paul would have, I agree, would have considered it a historical reality, right?
Right.
But nonetheless, what he's concluding from the story, we may agree with.
Right.
In other words, right? The fact that, when we look at humanity, we're problematic. We, like you mentioned, we're flawed. We quote sin. That's one thing that I think we can almost anybody can agree with. But the fact that for Paul, the Adam and Eve thing is a historical reality, for us, it's just an illustrative, a story or illustrative, mythology, or really kind of an anti-mythology. So what? You still end up at this. I think you still end up pretty much at the same place.
And here's the thing, Scott. I do think that Paul believed Adam was a real person because of his context and his upbringing.
I do too. Yeah.
But I think at the same time, whether he did or not doesn't matter, because he was using the story to make a point. And that's kind of what you were saying there, that we can learn something from it. It's illustrative. Here's the thing. Paul was using the idea of Adam to make a theological point.
Yes.
He used his science of his day to unpack a theological idea. Just like any other modern preacher today might use a scientific discovery or a Hollywood sci-fi movie or a fictional character from culture to unpack a theological idea.
Right.
They do it all the time. And that's my second point. Paul was making a theological point out of this story of this guy named Adam. Paul grew up with the Torah, with scriptures that we today refer to as the Old Testament, that had a very Jewish message. Their gospel was very much for the Jews, and Christ presented a newer gospel that was also very much for the Jews. Early in his ministry, he said to people and commanded his disciples, hey, this is only for us Jews. And sure, later he expanded the mandate to include non-Jews. But for years afterwards, his disciples, the leaders of the early Christian church, were still taking it mostly to the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
They always taught in the synagogues rather than the public square, which they could have done. They required circumcision and a lot of other very Jewish laws. It took a lot of effort to fully open the doors of their message to non-Jews. And Paul was very much part of that. And so here he's using the concept of a primal pair, the father and mother of all people, Jews and non-Jews, to emphasize the universality of his message, the new Christianity.
Yeah, I think this is the absolutely overriding concern of almost all of Paul's theology. What does Jesus mean, in a sense, for the future of Judaism? And so, for example, in Romans, where you have the heart of his Adamic kind of thinking, what's he doing there? He's trying to say that this brokenness, applies to all of us, not just Jews. And therefore, as being part of this whole human race, that Jesus is for that whole human race as the second Adam. Right? The importance for Paul is the universality. He sees Adam as a representative of the human race and Christ as the second Adam, being the redeemer of the whole human race. And this is his major concern. And it's a theological concern. And so he uses the story of Adam, as he understood it at that time, to make that point, to illustrate that point. Now, if I put on my conservative hat for a minute, I could see a conservative arguing back and saying, yeah, but it's if you take away the historicity and so on, then and you lose that, does the theology depend on Adam being a historical figure? Does it depend on that? If it does,
And I don't think it does
yeah,
myself.
but that's the crux of it, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, so let me get to my second point
Yeah,
because I think this answers your question,
yeah,
Scott. The question being, did Paul believe that this was historical? And I'm suggesting that he didn't need to have, he may not. But to answer your question more specifically, did the Jews as a people group, did they believe that this was historical and absolutely essential to the whole story of redemption? And I don't think they did at all. Here's why I say that. The Old Testament and the ancient Jews never refer to Adam and Eve as the conduits through which sin and death came into the world. They described in great detail all kinds of sacrifices that were needed to atone for sin. All those different laws, those different sacrifices and rituals that you find in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, but they never related those sacrifices or that sin in any way to the primal couple in that event, the garden and taking the apple from the tree. Just try to find one reference to Adam or Eve or the garden or the tree and the fruit in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. You won't find them there. Instead, the whole entire atonement story was tied up into the covenant that Yahweh made with the nation of Israel and them breaking that covenant by worshiping a golden calf from Egypt. In fact, just days after Yahweh had led them out of captivity in Egypt. That's what atonement was all about to them, the ones who wrote the Old Testament. It was all about them and the golden calf event, not about Adam and Eve and the fruit from the tree in the Garden of Eden. Eve is never mentioned outside of the first few chapters of Genesis, and Adam only comes up a couple other times, both of which being when the author is giving a genealogical history of the nation of Israel, the patriarchs of that nation. And basically, they were just saying, well, okay, Adam was the first guy, and then we had Seth, and then we had Enosh, and a long list of people. You get the idea. It was just a couple simple mentions in a long and boring genealogical list, but nothing, absolutely nothing anywhere at all about original sin in that tree in the garden.
Yeah, I agree. It certainly it plays such a major role in Christian thinking and theology, and yet you're right. It's certainly not explicated. I mean, you can put together arguments from the Old Testament for it, but not in a clear fashion that you're describing. And certainly you're right. Like if Adam is that important a figure, then why doesn't he play a much bigger role in the later history of Israel? And
exactly,
and he really doesn't.
I know. I kept pushing Joshua on this point that this focus on the primal pair was ultimately directed toward the doctrine of original sin.
Yeah,
and he tried to clarify. He tried to emphasize that his motive was simply to take away a major argument, a popular argument that creates division among Christians. And so he, as he put it, he claimed that his proposal was meant to stop people using science as a theological club. He said that you can deny the biblical account of a primal couple, but you can no longer do so on scientific grounds. And on the other hand, you can deny evolution, but not on scientific grounds. He's just trying to get rid of that science as a club idea.
Yes.
Science is no longer a legitimate argument for leaning one way or the other on this matter. And that's what he claimed. And I took that at face value and I appreciated that. But then when I was listening to our interview later, actually, when I was preparing for this episode, so sorry, Joshua, if you're listening, this only occurred to me long after the interview was done. It was at that time I noticed that some particular wording was used at a point in the interview when I asked about the people who lived and died in far off places, thousands of miles away from the Garden of Eden and thousands of years after this proposed first Adam and Eve. So I was referring to people like the indigenous tribes of South America and Australia and Tasmania. And he answered that there might be a special dispensation of grace for these people. And I don't know how to parse those words, special dispensation of grace, except to say those people were damned under this doctrine of original sin, a damnation that is transmitted through sex, the genetic lineage, or through marriage, parenting, and adoption, the genealogical lineage, and they therefore needed a special get out of jail free card.
That's one way to put it. There is a line of theological thinking that argues that before people had the opportunity to have revelation, to know about Christ, that they aren't held responsible for that lack of understanding. And if they followed the light within them to the best that they could, that's an argument. That's a line of thinking.
Right.
And that's probably what he's referring to when he talks about a special dispensation of grace.
Well,
but I don't want to put words in his mouth either. So
Okay, and I wasn't the only one who seemed to notice this kind of thing. We had listener feedback, and here's a few responses from some people. Here's an excerpt from a long series of comments between Robert and a couple other people. Robert said, I also enjoyed the episode, but it did leave me with the nagging feeling that it still seemed like this premise for the science was to find a way to fit the Adam and Eve story to reality. I know it was indicated on multiple occasions that this was not the case, but with the comments made throughout the episode, including where the creation order was raised, there seemed to be a bit of dodging and modern tweaks to make it fit. And so that was what Robert said. Here's another one from John in our private Facebook discussion group. John said, I would ask Swamidass if there is any positive reason to believe the story besides allowing a literal interpretation of early Genesis. To me, it seems ad hoc. And Dustin, in that same group, emphatically echoed John's point about this being very much an ad hoc thing.
Yeah, well, as mentioned earlier, I got a similar sense. I think less so. I think, in a sense, Swamidass's bigger concern is, like you mentioned, the kind of the relationship between science and theology. Can't we be friends? Okay, so if he can remove this scientific objection, then that helps with that
Right.
agenda. On the other hand, I think with a guy like William Lane Craig, I think it's much more what Robert and John are pointing to there. That it's much more yeah.
Okay, Scott, we need to draw a line under this one. There will be tons more that could be said, but we've prattled on quite long enough.
Yeah, so next week we're going to hear from author Becca McNeil about her recent book, Deconstructing One's Faith While Having Kids, a provocative title, and I'm sure something that will be quite relevant to a lot of our listeners who were keen for us to do this episode because many of them know from personal experience how complicated that can get. And for those listeners who don't have kids, if you think you've got your deconstruction perfectly under control and you're quite comfortable now with a faith or maybe even a non-faith that looks completely different from what you grew up with, well, just wait till you do have kids.
So we'll see you next week.
Ciao.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.